Hi guys, welcome to Grow Up. Today we've got two amazing guests. We've got Dr. Bob Sears and we've got Melissa Floyd. They've been incredible advocates, educators around all things having to do with health. So thank you guys for coming on today.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
yeah, thanks, Ron.
So we had the pleasure of listening to your guys' podcast last night. And you guys were talking about things that are really in alignment with a lot of things we've talked about with our viewers, especially when it has to do with control. So my first question is, the control mechanisms we've seen being put into place all over the country, do you think these are going to stop when, let's say Joe Biden says, oh, I want to do this for 100 days, 100 more days. Do you think this really stops, or once you give the power to people, are they going to abuse it?
Well, I know for me, I'm really just concerned that this started in March and April as a 2 weeks thing to begin with.
Yeah.
Because there was already supposed to be an exit point. And that exit point never really happened, really. And so not only that, but now it's come back with stricter mandates, and we're seeing new second lockdowns. Like, the thing I'm concerned with in general is that the word has not been honored from the beginning.
Yeah.
So here we are, when you say 100 days, and I saw somebody post this, which I thought was kind of funny. Well, if 2 weeks equals 9 months, then what does 100 days equal?
Yeah.
If we're using the fractions the way that they're doing math. I don't believe anything that's being said anymore. And I think that they have done that, regardless of who's in power. Whoever's in control here has done that, and we can't trust their word anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that in itself is really dangerous, because we're left at this point where everything's up in the air.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what's going to happen. And I don't know if our freedoms will ever come back. I don't know if they intend to do that or if it's going to get worse. And all we know is what they've said they're going to do is not what they honor.
Yeah.
So from this point on, everything that is being said to me, I can't trust.
Yeah.
And also the politicization that you were talking about last night is that this isn't just about health information that we're receiving and accurate statistics. There's an active manipulation going on of what science is, and we're moralizing science instead of just referring to science as science, right? Can you talk about that? Like, just the scientific method, like, where did that go? Where did basic biology go? Where does virus, the definition of what a virus is and how it behaves?
Well, I think when this started, many of us were afraid. Most of us were afraid. And we thought it was going to be really, really bad. And so a lot of us thought that 2 weeks was a great idea. And not everyone did, but I think most people did. But right away, scientists all over the world started saying, hey, this isn't going to work. Mitigating measures against the virus like this won't really work. They started talking about all the harms that are going to come from strict lockdowns and prolonged lockdowns. Scientists all over the world, and academic researchers, people who study politics, economists, all kinds of articles written in mainstream institutions. People are writing about what this is going to do to the economy and mental health and everyone's health, and the ill effects on our society, on our whole world, right? And so many people have now realized what we've been doing this whole time is is just straight up wrong. It has not been the right approach because it won't work. So I think people have to ask, if you think this has been a great idea, do you see any evidence that we've made any progress against this virus? We haven't. And so we didn't need to do all these strict lockdowns, as harshly as we have. And so why are politicians afraid of changing course? We now have the science to know that a virus like this is going to spread through homes. It's going to spread through communities. It's going to spread through families. So you just lock down everybody, it's just going to spread anyway in the main places where we're telling everyone to stay.
Yeah.
Right? And so if we now know that's not going to work, why can't a politician be brave enough to say, okay, now we have the science. Now we know, this is just going to go through us. Maybe we'll have a vaccine. Maybe that will help. But we don't have to shut down the world anymore. And I think most Americans and most people probably, I think, believe that we don't have to shut down anymore.
Yep.
But the politicians just aren't listening.
Yeah.
And I don't get that.
That's one of the most destructive things in politics, is this idea that you can never admit that you made the wrong decision. I think that our best leaders historically are people who were able to say, you know what, I made this decision, I firmly made it, I take responsibility for it, but we need to do something different.
Or this was the best
Nobody's
information
doing
we had at the time.
Right,
We have no information. But even the state epidemiologists in Sweden were saying all of the countries going into the 2 week lockdown, there is no exit strategy.
Yep.
And so they already looked ahead to say, how do you come out of this successfully? You don't.
Yeah.
You don't, because if you slowly start to open things up again, the virus is going to spread again, and then you're going to think you need to lock down again.
Yeah.
And so I think the biggest scientific problem was that there was no real plan to get out of this. They kind of took an abrupt policy, and they did not think about how we were going to get out of it. And so now that we're getting out of it, we're back in it again, because you can't hide from a virus.
Well, what's going to happen long term with what we've done to science over this last, 9-10 months? Because you look at something like the largest randomized controlled mask study, the Danish mask study that was just printed in the, what was it? Who did it? Who finally printed it? The journal. It was the Annals of Medicine. So they had 5 different medical journals refuse to print it.
Right.
And it wasn't for any sort of concern about the fact that they thought something was wrong in the study. They had no questions about the fact that the study was done correctly. It was that it was unpopular.
Oh yeah, right, of course.
And so it took something like 5 months after they'd already had a finished study and the conclusion that they reached and whatnot. They had that, and it took 5 months to get somebody to print it. And what it says is that the mask is doing nothing to protect you. And that's why they didn't want to print it. They didn't look at, in this study, they didn't look at if it's protecting other people, but they looked at, is it protecting you? And they came to the conclusion that there was no statistical significance that it was doing anything. But the fact it took that long to get the science out to the public, what is that going to look like in the future if that's what we're looking at now with science? Is this something that's going to offend the public?
Right, and well, I think the way we look at science here is science is showing information from both sides. There's like pro-mask science, and there's anti-mandate mask science, and there's coronavirus is horrible, it's going to kill everybody science, and then there's no, it's a mild respiratory disease for almost everybody, and then there's select groups that it's going to be serious for. There's like science people are using from both sides, and what we always like to tell people is whenever you see a scientific narrative where it's so polar opposite, you have to pause and realize, therefore, we don't exactly know what the right thing to do is.
Yeah.
We can't say we know strict mask mandates and strict lockdowns and shutting down the entire world is the right course, because half the science shows it's not the right course, and half the experts out there say it's not the right course.
And in this case, more than half.
Right.
I mean, it just so happens. But this idea of unpopularity, I mean, we've been dealing with that in the vaccine safety movement for a really long time.
Yeah.
There is science to say it's not safe for everyone to have all doses of vaccines, but there's also science to say they're totally safe and effective. And my big thing has always been, if you have conflicting science, then you don't have consensus.
Yeah.
And if you don't have consensus, you shouldn't have mandates.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. If there is a debate in the scientific world, the fact that that even exists should be enough to say, okay, so we can't mandate this. This needs to be a matter of option or choice. And what they're doing now is they're mandating things that are completely unsettled.
I would take it a step further and say, even if you met a consensus where everybody, let's say 98% of people agreed, I would still say that the government doesn't have a right to mandate something to do it. And that's what makes America so special. And that 98% can look at the other 2% and be like, you guys are crazy. That's fine. That's your right. Look at them and say you think they're crazy. But you can't mandate them to do something that they don't want to do to their body, like inject something in their body.
But if 2% of science told me that aluminum's neurotoxic and can cause permanent damage, that's still 2% more than zero. And that's still a concern to me. Because to me, it's not even about your opinion of whether the consensus agrees with the science, it's about whether that science exists. And that science does exist on both sides of the vaccine safety movement, which is why that's really our big focus has always been bringing that science to light. Oh, by the way, there's also a study that shows this. There's also a study that shows this. And just to make you think. And the same thing you're talking about, that science gets shut down. They're forced to retract their studies. They're not allowed to be published. We've interviewed 2 amazing researchers that have dealt with the pushback, Chris Shaw and Christopher Exley, that are specialists who found themselves accidentally in the vaccine conversation because of aluminum research, and they're totally shunned in the medical community, even though they literally followed the science the way they've always done. It's just that the conclusion was unpopular. And unpopular science becomes hidden science. And so now people just hashtag science
Yeah.
But really, it's just a matter of my science versus your science. And so the word really has no meaning anymore.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
Well, and there's a concerted effort to discredit that which you don't politically align with, instead of saying, you know, let's look at it all, because a true you know, somebody who really does believe in science would want to see all the science, and that's part of the method.
Yeah.
So, you know, I feel like it's anti-science to not want to see these other studies that are in conflict with your own belief systems and narratives. I mean, I think what's the most dangerous too with the censorship of science and conversations in general is this underpinning idea that government is now going to make our health decisions.
Sure.
And that could really, I mean, be as extensive as the additional 150 vaccines coming down the pipeline as to what they feel we all need in this one-size-fits-all approach. Or it could be something as, you know, benign as everybody needs more vitamin C. Let's put some vitamin C in the water supply. I think it's all wrong because it takes away our individualism. It takes away our right to make decisions based on who we are as individuals, our unique body composition. You probably know as a doctor, you know, every child is different. Their experience, their reaction to different medicines. Mm-hmm. You can't just say, oh, you have an acid reflux, this medicine will work for you. And most recently, there's an acid reflux medicine that has been recalled because it was ruining a lot of digestive systems and having horrible effects. What is with, you know, there's the suppression, that you know, the concerted effort to not only suppress mothers, specifically vaccine-injured children and fathers to families, but denial of this happening. There's an active, concerted denial that vaccine injury occurs.
Right.
Right. It shocks me, and that's really how I got into the whole vaccine-informed consent movement and vaccine injury awareness. Is I was in medical school at Georgetown University, and I read a book that the book was literally every scientific research study that had ever been done on the DTP vaccine. And it turns out this vaccine was causing severe brain damage to a very small percentage of kids, but the damage was devastating. And the science was irrefutable. The science was very, very clear. There was no doubt. And so, but like you said, that science was suppressed because the medical community was so afraid of stopping the DTP vaccine, which was controlling pertussis or whooping cough, that they felt, you know, we can't live without the vaccine. We just have to let this continue, and too bad for the minority who are injured. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how we moved into the whole vaccine debate with that kind of mindset. Mm-hmm. Everybody on the scientific level knew it was causing injury, but everyone was denying it, and they were not telling the consumers and the parents. Mm-hmm. So and that was back when we were only giving like 8 vaccines, you know, or 8 shots. Now we give like, you know, 50 injections, and it encompasses 69 doses of vaccination. Mm-hmm. Still in this whole climate where vaccine injury is so rare, no one has to worry about it. And what we're finding is it's not rare. It does happen. When it happens, it's devastating. Yet our scientific community, our practicing, you know, group of doctors in our country, none of them will admit it. Mm-hmm. They won't give anyone that warning, because once you give someone that warning, they're like, okay, pause. I need to know more. Yeah. They don't want anyone to know that. They just want you to say, yeah, 99.9% chance your child's probably going to be fine. Mm-hmm. And so we're not going to tell you might be that little tiny, less than 1% who could suffer severe brain injury, just, you know, right in the name of science. Well, so also, it's like the science is clear, it happens. Mm-hmm. That's irrefutable. Mm-hmm. So why won't they talk about it?
I think the big issue is that people assume that vaccine injury or vaccine reactions are trips to the emergency room. They think it's going to be some very grand, obvious response that just happens, an acute response that happens right away. Mm-hmm. But what I find the majority of vaccine injury is more cumulative, and it's more sometimes mild, and sometimes people just think, oh, my kid was born this way, or this little disorder, or this little behavioral thing. So we've taught ourselves to look for vaccine injury to be like something very dramatic. Mm-hmm. And so people go, oh, my kid didn't go into convulsions, so I guess they're fine. Mm-hmm. And instead of teaching parents and doctors being honest with parents about, well, here are some little things that may in fact be a result of the toxicity from this, you know, the increased number of doses. Because I think the 1% quote, that, or the less than 1% quote of something very severe is true, but of course that number is much bigger for the milder reactions. And the milder reactions are just as concerning, because that could be something that leads to, the changing of your life on some level. And then again, if you're seeing these mild reactions, you might want to stop at a certain point so that it doesn't turn into a more serious one. But they basically just negate all the mild things. They don't want to put that even into the bucket. So it's only serious ones. That's why they can keep quoting, it's so rare. It's so rare. This hardly ever happens. But what doesn't hardly ever happen is all the other stuff. And that's the stuff we see people talk about all the time. And often it's multiple things.
Right.
It'll be this mild thing, this mild thing, this mild thing. Together, you've got a kid who has some issues that you're going to constantly have to worry about as a parent.
Right, because I think, for your audience, the people are, might be out there, they hadn't thought about much about vaccines. But if they have young children, I feel like everyone in America can agree that we all want to raise our kid as organically as we can. And we like to avoid GMO foods because they're very artificially, created, and we worry about things like that. We worry about pesticide exposure. We worry about, could all these, toxic exposures from our environment have negative effects on our kids? So we all take steps to mitigate that, right? Every parent out there, we don't just purposely fill our kid with chemicals. So the question is, why are vaccines different from that? People think vaccines are just germs and water, right, injected into you, and they're perfectly safe. No, where the cumulative effects can eventually cause some unseen harm is you get injected with formaldehyde and lots of chemicals I can't even pronounce. Used to get injected with mercury. Now that's only in the flu shots, but there are probably 50 different chemicals you are injecting your child with multiple times at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 5 years, 12 years, repeatedly.
And getting it in the environment. So it's not even just, vaccines are only one of the things that we're adding to our body, which is why certain kids' toxicity levels are different.
But that's where this cumulative, low level of harm, that might not be obvious right at the start, but then all of a sudden your child is 3 years old. And their brain isn't quite developed the way it should. Maybe their speech is delayed. Maybe they have other mild neurological problems. Maybe they have little learning disorders. You've kept them free of all the environmental toxins growing up as a baby, but you've subjected them to repeated toxicity and vaccines. And that's where I think where parents need to start investigating this and questioning, is that an overload? Would it be safer to delay certain things? Could you make a more natural decision for your child that's going to be safer in the long run? I'm not saying, none of us are ever saying don't vaccinate. We're simply saying start reading about it, investigating it so you kind of know what the toxicity
Why not?
is.
Yeah, because you should be choosing, you should be deciding what's safe for your child.
And
you should be
customize
fully informed.
It's a universal program. You were saying at the beginning, every child and every adult, our bodies all respond differently. But the way that the vaccination program works, it's everybody gets this at this time, every time.
And that's it. Yeah, exactly. Our bodies are so different. For me, I have a severe vitamin D deficiency, so I have to take an amount of vitamin D that would probably make her very sick, and so we can't treat people the same way. So I want to switch gears a little bit to why medical freedom is so important. So I want to give you sort of a scenario. So if a mom goes in, they get their kid, say, the flu zone shot back then. We talked about this before. I've shown the insert before, or not the insert, the actual study they did, the safety study that they paid for, and it showed children within the study getting febrile seizures. So let's say you get your kid that shot, okay? It got approved anyways, despite the seizures, and your kid has a febrile seizure. Okay, and then you decide, you know what, because of this experience, I don't want to go make them a test dummy. There must be some sort of reason here that I should pull back for a while and let their immune system fight and try to get them better. What kind of discrimination do they face? Because this is what got me very interested in this whole thing. Because I started hearing from parents who were viewers of our show that were saying, please talk about this issue. I can't even see a doctor. Doctors won't see my kids because I'm saying that, in a state like California, that I don't feel safe doing this because my child got severely injured. And they won't even see them for a cold because of it. So what kind of stuff have you guys heard of that parents face as a result of these injuries?
Well, let me just say really fast, because this is directly affects my personal experience, because I did have a febrile seizure as a child and was hospitalized for that. And then I had a daughter who had responses that were very similar. And if you look in the
Two
literature,
vaccines.
two vaccines, right? If you look in the literature, and they talk about febrile seizures, they consider those mild.
Mhm.
That is not considered really a serious reaction. So it's just commonplace. And I think that is where the divide happens when you come to a doctor and say, but my kid had a febrile seizure. They go, oh, that's fine. They'll grow out of it by the time they're 5 years old. But we did an episode on this because I'm personally very interested in it because of my own family story. But when I looked into febrile seizures, there's like recent data that basically shows a super increased connection to mood disorders, including anxiety,
Yeah.
which is something I have and deal with. And now I wonder about that connection when I was a child.
Yeah.
So it's something I deal with every single day.
Mhm.
And I choose to deal with it non-medicated. But my point is, it's definitely something that affects my quality of life.
Yeah.
So when they say something's mild, you're going to grow out of it. They had me on phenobarbital till I was 5. So every time I had a fever, you'd be on anti-seizure medication. Well, another study showed that actually decreased the IQ an average of 8 points on the people that took that medication as children. And so on top of that, it wasn't actually preventing further seizures.
Mhm.
So what they all looked at as mild, and they had their treatment protocol as mild, turns out not to be so mild. And so again, they're pushing down the seriousness and the truth to the concerns that these parents have, as this doesn't really count as an issue. So if I come to a pediatrician and tell them that, they're going to say it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
And I did have a pediatrician tell me, if you don't continue to vaccinate my daughter, even after what happened to her, after her 19 doses, we were kicked out of that office.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what happens. But part of the reason it happens is because the medical community has chosen to not, like I said, see some of these vaccine reactions as significant or valuable or true or something to be concerned with.
Mhm.
So they basically just shut you off completely
Mhm.
from that medical care. And we've been in that situation. We're currently in that situation.
That's what drives me crazy is,
Yeah.
is that, and seeing the faces of
Yeah.
parents
Mm-hmm.
who have had this happen and seeing their children, and then to see the reactions they get where people treat them like they're
Right.
crazy.
Right.
I'm an objective party here. My kids didn't have seizures, none of these things, but I'm looking at these people and I can see they're not lying. These are parents who love their kids, and the fact they get treated like they're crazy people is really what made us go, you know what, we need to use our platform for good and talk about this so that people are aware that these are not just some crazy people
Right.
who have concerns. These are legitimate concerns that people have, and we're not telling people don't get anything. We're saying use your brain, look at the studies, look at what, if you look at theirs, you look and see how many things have been reported about this specific vaccine.
Right.
Does the risk outweigh the benefit?
They're not all
You know,
the same
they're not
either.
the same.
They're
They're
not all the same.
Right.
And febrile seizures are listed in multiple vaccine
Yeah.
research. That's a
Yeah.
very common reaction, which should, again, common does not mean normal
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
or
Well,
acceptable.
Yeah.
right. Well, what we're taught as a pediatrician, I'm a pediatrician, so I know what we're taught. And we were taught this, 20 years ago when I was in medical school, 25 years ago. And they're still taught that today. And this is how they get around us. This is how doctors function in the world of continuing to give vaccines despite serious reactions happening in other patients. We are literally taught that every vaccine reaction is coincidental. Because you can't prove the fact that you just had your flu shot and that night you had a febrile seizure and went to the ER and needed seizure medication and needed a brain scan, and you might have more febrile seizures now moving forward. And despite the fact that febrile seizure is listed as a possible side effect in the safety studies, what your doctor who's managing your care is taught is no, the vaccine does not cause that seizure, it's coincidental. Therefore, you can conveniently just set it aside and tell the patients it's fine, it would have happened anyway, it's not the vaccine. And let's move on and keep vaccinating. So that's the mindset.
Even though they admit it in their own studies.
Right, even though this scientifically we know what happens. And so
You can't argue
I think-
seizures. That's
Yeah.
definitely in the
Right.
literature.
What's in there? There's nerve injuries. You could lose function in one of your limbs.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of serious allergic reactions
Paralysis.
you could have.
Traverse myelitis.
Spinal cord paralysis. You could actually, actually scientific studies have demonstrated, severe brain injuries from some vaccines. So we know the science is there. But so everyone wonders, well, if the science is so obvious, why aren't pediatricians doing something about it? Because we are sat down in medical school and say, all you guys don't have to worry about it. It's okay. It's all coincidental. Let's keep vaccinating. And that does a huge disservice. And so kind of what you said, well, I need to find a doctor. My doctor won't see me. Well, this kind of approach is kind of turning people away from modern mainstream medicine. They're turning away from it in droves because doctors aren't listening.
Right.
And so parents have to become the specialists and the researchers,
Right.
and then you find an open-minded doctor that's willing to talk to you about
Well, you'd think that in the spirit of why doctors got into medicine was to be helpful and educate, right?
To be
and be
servants.
part of what they agreed to legally, to be part of that informed consent process. You guys did an excellent episode on your podcast about informed consent. I learned a lot about that legality, so I'd love for you to talk about what that looks like, and also maybe draw some parallels to the informed. Are we getting informed consent on the COVID vaccine? Are we getting informed consent really with the mask? I'd love to bring that in as well.
Yeah, well, informed consent in vaccination started as a federal law in 1986. They actually mandated every doctor is supposed to give about 2 pages worth of informed consent, which isn't even complete in of itself, but it's something. So doctors are federally mandated to give patients informed consent about all the risks of vaccination and the benefits, and let them make a choice. Well, state laws don't mandate it, though. So actually, in reality, no doctor is ever legally required to give any sort of informed consent for vaccines, because state law trumps federal law, as it should. Right? I think we would all agree we like the states to have jurisdiction over medical laws, unless you live in California, where we live, where these mandates. I want to talk about mandates too, but so informed consent is only a federal law, so doctors don't have to follow it. But it's, I remember, I kind of cringe at this story, and when we had our first kid, we were given that informed consent. We were sitting there in a pediatrician's office, and we were reading the piece of paper that said, your child's going to get the DTP vaccine, and by the way, there's a very tiny risk of severe brain injury, or your child could die from a severe reaction to this vaccine. And my wife, Cheryl, she's like, well, I don't want to give this vaccine. This sounds horrible. And I was like, well, no, we have to do it for the good of society. And
It's your patriotic duty.
I know, but see, doctors are afraid if you give that kind of informed consent, parents will start saying no. So medical organizations and medical associations in every state rose up and said, we can't give informed consent for vaccinations. If we do, people will stop vaccinating, which should say something. It shouldn't, the conclusion shouldn't be, let's stop giving informed consent. The conclusion should be, let's make vaccines safer so they don't cause these kinds of reactions.
Why is that a radical idea to advocate simply for safety
exactly.
and transparency and better conversations regarding informed consent? I know that when I asked questions, I felt demonized and shamed. And I'd say that, if you're talking about sexuality, is that informed consent? If you feel demonized or shamed into having sex with somebody, that's not consensual. And that's really how I feel like a lot of parents, feel when they go into the doctor's office and they just have a question. They're immediately met with this, this resistance. Oh, are you one of them? Are you an anti-vaxxer? What website have you been to? Like as if we're not trying to educate ourselves. And the genuine interest of just trying to find more information is met with that very hostile environment. So, our parents are really getting that.
Well, the worst part of that is what happens when you're in that situation is you go through with it anyway, and you think about it after. So you feel pushed. You feel pushed to do it because you're feeling so uncomfortable in that moment that you tend to go, well, okay, just go ahead and do it this time. And you're thinking, I'll take the sheet home with me and I'll look at it then. And then it's the chance to actually research something. You get bullied and coerced into doing it. But the problem is that one time could be too much for your child. And there can be like permanent damage that you cannot take back. And they're not encouraging you to do that research ahead of time. And oftentimes these statements that they give you, like I always tell Dr. Bob, they give it to you and they'll go, okay, the nurse is coming in to give you your vaccine. Like, it's literally a number of seconds. You didn't get to go take that home and look at it and look up the links and talk to your spouse or partner or child's parent or whatever. You don't get to do any of that. And you don't want to be that person, right? You don't want to be that person who's questioning them, and you're just a mom, especially as a woman. And so when you come in and have that pressure on you, sometimes we consent almost like involuntarily. We don't want to consent, but we're feeling pushed to or rushed to, or they're kind of like, I've got to get to my next person. Come on, like, let's go.
What kind of mother are you?
And it is violating. I've talked to so many mothers who feel, I feel it was violating to me for the fact that they didn't give me all of the side effects and tell me all the things that could happen. They didn't give me a more than one thing, a fever being the thing that could happen. So I do feel violated as a parent because I don't feel like that information was given to me, which is what really like lit the flame for me to want to do what we do, which is to give parents the information I wasn't given. The information you have a right to know, but it's not popular or it's not favorable to them. And so what they've decided is let's hide the information that isn't favorable because that might make you go in a different course of action. We want you to go in this course of action, which essentially is just compliance. We don't want you to question, we want you to comply. So if we're going to put this information that makes you question, that's going to take us away from our goal, which is to get you doing what we want you to do. And I watched an old documentary back in 1982 where like the FDA representative on there is like, and he accidentally said this, but it was already in the program and they would never air this today. But he basically said if we told parents all of the side effects, they wouldn't do it. And he said that, and he's a representative from the FDA basically saying, we know the side effects are there, but if we're honest with you, you won't do it. And my big belief is you have a right to know.
You have a right to protect your child.
You have a right to know the information. If it's not favorable, that's not my problem.
Right.
Like you're saying. Then make them safer. So how about you eliminate the thing that's unfavorable?
Right.
Don't blame me for having access to the information. Blame the fact that there is a negative component to your product as a consumer advocate.
Exactly. You know, it's just that it's crazy that we're even having this conversation about the COVID vaccine because we're talking about something that is the most rushed vaccine in history. There is literally no scientific way, none, where in this period of time you could actually test something and say it's safe. That you're injecting into billions of people, not millions, billions of people. So we have no clue what this is going to do in the long term. And secondarily, the other thing everybody seems to be missing, and I guarantee you over 90% of the pool of people who are going to get this vaccine have no clue, that this is a brand new technology too. It's not only the most rushed vaccine in history, it's also a new type of way of making vaccines that we have never used before. So what does that concern you as a doctor that we're using a brand new method that we've rushed through in a period of time we've never done before? We're not doing safety studies on, hey, if you have diabetes, what happens to you if you take this? If you're actually a sick elderly person, what happens to you? We're doing the most narrow studies possible. You know, how did these super healthy people react to this? It's an experiment. You know,
but on the entire
population,
which has never happened.
Which is why, even if up to this point you couldn't stand people who just would argue about vaccines or anything. I mean, this is the one thing you should be able to agree on. That like, hey, people have a right not to be experimented on. You know, this is something we've always been able to agree with. You know, amongst humanity, is don't do human experiments on people who are unwilling. That's always been seen as something that, you know, communists and dictators do. Free countries don't do this.
And you know they're not going to be transparent with the information because the whole world's watching. They can't come out and go, oh, turns out this doesn't work. Or turns out this is really, you know, dangerous. And my kind of theory of what's going to happen is they're going to make this vaccine very mild so that people don't get hurt because everybody's watching, but it's also not going to work. And they're going to end up blaming the people who don't get the vaccine on the fact that it doesn't work.
Well, if you look back to what you said at the beginning, you know, about these people, this is something that is not new. Like they know what they're doing when it comes to the way they wrap and package all of this. You know, and so when you look at what's going to happen, you know, people need to know ahead of time that all of these companies, they're immune from being sued. You know, they've already been given that. That should concern people in itself. If you went into a store, you went into Walmart and you wanted to buy like a toy car for your kids and they said, hey, just so you know, all these companies, you can't sue them. You can't sue them if it blows up and your child dies. People would be like, well, I'm not going to buy that car. That's crazy. Has it blown up before? And 1 out of 100, something like that. We don't know. It was, you know, and to be honest, it could have blown up for any reason. Who's to say the kid didn't blow up and blew up the car, you know?
But he's not putting the car inside his body either. So at least he has some level of safety.
But even in that situation, parents would be like, this is crazy, we're leaving, you know? But we don't even get that with this. You know, it's just you have to do it, period. That's where the consensus scientifically in the media seems to be, is that this is something everybody must do.
Well, I think what people need to be aware of is something unique about the COVID vaccine it's not being developed by a bunch of, expert scientists who have devoted their whole lives in studying, viruses and studying vaccines and working to develop vaccines. These aren't being developed by academic institutions or medical universities or objective groups of scientists that are trying to find an answer for the world that's going to be safe and healthy for people to get. These COVID vaccines are being manufactured by big pharma, by the pharmaceutical companies that brought you, what was the drug that, I don't know, I'm blanking on the drug. Oh well, but they brought you up,
Vioxx?
yeah, like Vioxx, right? How many times have we heard that pharmaceutical companies have made a drug or a medical device that ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people and they had to take it off the market? Mm-hmm. And then when those companies are investigated, they find that that the CEOs or the chief medical officers, they literally committed fraud, and they were found criminally negligent because they hid safety data. Yeah. If you look at any major pharmaceutical company, you just Google search this and look at how many fraud cases and criminal negligent cases have been brought up against these companies, including Pfizer, which is one of the forerunners for one of the front runners for the COVID vaccine. These are the companies that are making this vaccine. For-profit companies who have CEOs and they have stockholders. And what happened to the stock of each of these companies as soon as they announced their 95% efficacy? Stock shoots up. People get to sell off some of their shares to make a nice little bonus. Mm-hmm. These are the companies that are making the vaccines that are supposedly going to save the world from COVID. Yeah. It's not mainstream medical science. It's not academic science. It's not peer-reviewed objective science. It's commercial, experimental science, science in quotes. People have to realize that, realize how you said it's being rushed. Instead of 3 years of safety and efficacy research that most vaccines go through, this is just 8 or 9 months so far. And what scares me even more is if all that isn't scary enough, what I worry about, kind of like you said, is once this vaccine is released, they're going to think it's so effective and so great and so safe with no side effects. There's going to be huge pressure to hide any problems. We've already talked about how much they hide problems with the standard vaccines. How much even more are they going to try to hide problems with the COVID vaccine? Because this is what's supposed to save humanity.
No politicians are going to want to walk it back. None of them. None of them are going to want to walk it back because they've all praised this. And I'd say on the pharmaceutical company side too, for them, it's much more important that there is no pullback on this having any issues because they're getting something that is worth a whole lot more than just the immediate cash, the immediate stock bump. Oh, yeah. They're psychologically, the way people have thought about pharmaceutical companies over a long period of time has gotten drastically more negative as time has gone on. During this period of time, they've been praised as saviors and heroes. And so if they're able to shift that dynamic, that's the most valuable thing to them that they could earn throughout this whole experience because that's going to increase the way that they're allowed to raise the price of drugs over time, which is going to be the most profitable thing for them.
Right, it's a long game.
Exactly, it's a long game of saying, you know what, this buys us another long period of time where we can focus on drugs that you have to take for 80 years instead of drugs that cure illnesses or drugs that are, maybe short-term, they can fix things more quickly. It allows you to put that focus on drugs you're going to have to take for 80 years. So I'd say they're the most invested in making sure that no problems surface, It
feels naive to me though, because I agree with you. That's what their intention is. I don't see it happening. I don't see this becoming a success story that ends up making people think more favorably about pharmaceutical products because I don't think it's going to be successful. I think it's not going to actually stop the virus from doing, because we know it doesn't stop transmission, and it's not going to be safe for everybody unless, like I said, they purposely basically diluted the product so that it doesn't hurt people, but then it doesn't work.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It hasn't been peer reviewed yet either. Any of these,
no,
right?
None of them. Right. All the hype you're hearing in the media is
that was the first thing I looked for.
Right. It's literally just the initial studies that the companies themselves have done and the data they've collected. Again, for-profit pharmaceutical companies. No one has verified this information.
What's semi-dangerous too is that we're moving from sort of the idea of having somebody, having a peer look at it who is in the industry, that is a scientist or somebody like that, to instead, the first person reviewing it are these government agencies, which is not always the case with these. In many different, examples, I'd say the vast majority, they have somebody else look at it, then it goes to the FDA or goes to whoever, NIH or whoever does it in another country. But in this case, we're handing it straight to the government to do it, who is invested in making sure this gets out to market.
Right.
But this isn't the first time they've lied about efficacy data either, because we know that happened with the mumps component of the MMR vaccine. I mean, they've published data that said, here's the number, and years later have had to go to court to fight that because it turns out they completely lied about it.
Yeah.
We don't know how many times that's happened. It could be multiple times, but this just came out. People are acting like that number is solid and it means anything. There's no real proof or information that it's going to do anything long term, like we said last night.
Right.
There's actually nothing that said. I mean, it's literally been a month or so of time. I mean, how can you all bank on this is what it does? It's going to do it every time for every single person.
Yeah, and I think for me, the overreaching goal of the work we do is, besides educating people and giving people the informed consent they won't get from their doctors, is to fight mandates, is to try to prevent vaccine mandates. And more states are starting to mandate vaccines. And people should be very concerned. Even people who think vaccines are perfectly safe and healthy and they get them all, they hopefully should be against mandates. Because the way the mandate laws are being written, like you said, the only people that can opt out are those who are immediately severely brain injured and go into a coma, or those who suffer severe anaphylactic shock and you have to get CPR and get a adrenaline shot to revive you. And those are the only people that now qualify for a medical excuse to not get that vaccine anymore. You still have to get all the rest of the vaccines. That's how the childhood vaccine mandate laws are changing in states. So they're going state by state, making it so no one can opt out. So that's childhood vaccines. The
And they can add COVID vaccines.
Right. So so COVID vaccine, people need to be very concerned that this untested experimental vaccine, they could mandate that vaccine next month. Some countries are already mandating it. And so I think that this, kind of like what you're saying, this is kind of waking people up to what we've been saying for years. The pharmaceutical companies that make the vaccines, and the FDA that evaluates them and then gives oversight, and the government committees that oversee all this, and then the medical associations that dispense it all, they're all working together, financially supporting each other and approving each other's products and paying left and right to get things approved. That's the climate in which we're developing and approving a COVID vaccine. And we're going to mandate something for everyone worldwide. In that kind of climate, that kind of experimental climate, that should worry everybody, even those who are going to get a COVID vaccine. Because like you said, we don't know that it prevents transmission to anybody. We don't know it's going to prevent infection. All it might do is kind of like what the flu shot does. It might make your symptoms milder as an individual, but you getting a COVID vaccine, just like you getting a flu vaccine, doesn't help anyone around you, because the science is very clear on the flu vaccine. It doesn't stop transmission. And I suspect the COVID vaccine will be the same until it's proven otherwise. So why mandate it? And that's what everyone should be concerned about.
You know what I think the biggest difference is between the two sides is that on one side you have people who do not want to force the other people to do anything. If you want to get it, go ahead and get it. No problem. Knock yourself out. We're all fine with it. But on the other side, you have people who are like, I want to force something into your body. Those are very different schools of thought. It's very hard to bridge that gap. I'll let you take the last question.
Yeah, and I know you guys have to go, so we're going to wrap up. But with that said, I think that this last question is really important. Is that there's this this illusion of moralizing this push for these mandates. This idea that, quite frankly, that the better of all, the collective, this which is elusive, is that it is better to care for the collective than it is for your own self and body, make your own choices. And it's really a false premise, but what can you say about that? But, this immunity, this whole immunity theory, like, well, it's not going to protect everybody unless you get the vaccine, you get the vaccine, you get the vaccine. It's the same thing they've been doing with the vaccines for years. Can you speak, to the science of that, the medical side of that, and share that research with people? Because I think that is unfortunately where people are being manipulated by the media to think that if you're not wearing a mask, you're making me sick, you're killing my grandma. If you don't get your vaccine, if something happens to my kid, I'm mad at you. You're gonna account for that.
Or also, mine doesn't work unless you get yours.
Exactly.
I'm vaccinated, of course, but mine's not going to work unless you also get vaccinated.
Right.
Like, that is kind of it's ridiculous when you think about it.
Yeah.
But that is kind of what they've done with the flu shot. Is kind of like, well, it only works if everybody gets it. And I've heard that with the COVID vaccine. And I just heard Mayor Lightfoot basically talk about how she said they're talking about mandating the vaccine, and she basically said we can't have people opting out in order for this to work.
Yeah. I just want to point out she got a horse killed, Mayor Lightfoot. Do you guys know about that?
No.
So the city of Chicago paid. I'm sorry, it drives me nuts. You just don't bring up Lightfoot. It drives me nuts. She got a horse murdered.
Oh my
But
God.
let's keep going.
All right. Sorry.
But
about
yes,
that.
this idea that it doesn't work unless everybody else gets it is part of the ethical shame argument that they're using because people are not willing to comply based on the science alone because the science isn't strong enough. So they've gone that extra step to say, you should feel really badly because it might not affect you, but what about all these other people? So you need to do it for them.
That's right.
But the bottom line is when you look at if a vaccine cannot prevent transmission, then me getting it isn't doing anything for the community. And they're using an argument that's flawed to sell the whole program.
Yeah.
Right. But that's, I think, probably the greatest misconception people have about all vaccines. They think it basically gives you some sort of magic shield of complete immunity. No matter how the vaccine is made, there are probably like 7 or 8 different types of vaccine technology. Each one works very different. And again, this is a brand new one that injects COVID RNA, which is similar to like your own DNA. Your RNA tells your cells what to do. So these COVID vaccines are going to give COVID RNA. It's going to go into all of your cells, take over your cellular machinery, start pumping out COVID proteins for your body to react against and to create some sort of immunity. This is very artificial immunity. And artificial immunity never works ideally, never works as good as natural immunity. But there's, again, people kind of just have this misconception that no matter what the shot is, it's going to protect everyone in every way imaginable. It's going to make you healthier. It's going to give you a stronger immune system artificially. It's going to stop you from catching the disease. It's going to stop you from passing it to everyone else. People actually think that is true for every vaccine.
Right.
And it is only true for maybe a select few vaccines. The vast majority of childhood vaccines we give don't do any of that. They only might make your own case of the disease milder. So at best, that's all the COVID vaccine might do. As far as what I've seen so far, it might make your individual case milder, yet no one's going to understand that. And
It's
so,
a
and so,
difficult thing to explain, to say to somebody like,
Right.
it's not only reduce your symptoms, and they're thinking, well, if I don't have symptoms, then I'm not spreading it. But they're not
Right.
understanding that you can actually be a silent carrier the way that everybody's so worried about with asymptomatic transmission.
right.
So they're selling that idea. That's the
Right.
idea to get
Well,
everybody to feel guilty.
Everyone already believes that idea.
And it's peer
Yeah.
pressure.
Everyone already thinks that's true for every vaccine. And so it's automatically has to be true for COVID vaccine. It's not. We don't know that it is. And until we have the science to show that it is, but they'll keep selling it that way because that is the only way to sell mandates. And people need to kind of wake up to that.
Yeah.
They've also never had a coronavirus vaccine that's been successful. In
Right.
any of
Right.
coronavirus.
Or like say with SARS. With SARS,
Right.
they worked
Yeah.
on it, and by the time they had it done, SARS had disappeared.
Right.
And it
I mean,
disappeared.
they've been trying to work on
Yes,
vaccines
yeah.
for cold viruses for years,
Right.
for decades.
Yeah.
The common cold, there's a lot of different viruses, including coronavirus, that can cause a common cold. They've been working on this for so long, and the cold virus has eluded our technology. And so what? All of a sudden, we now have mRNA vaccines that are somehow going to magically save everybody. there's no scientific justification to say that that's true.
Yeah.
Right.
And so people need to realize that and pause. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
pause,
Right.
look at it, and don't force it on people, and don't
Yeah.
support politicians that are pushing for a mandate because they don't have the medical justification for it.
Well, thank you. And where can we find more about your podcast and your website and your educational
Well,
resources?
we're the vaccine conversation with Melissa and Dr. Bob podcast. We've been doing it for a couple of years.
I'm Dr. Bob.
Um, over,
We live in 2020. You can do whatever you want.
we have over 100 episodes. We talk about pretty much everything there is to talk about vaccines, and we have a lot of fun doing it. I think we enjoy the conversation.
Where can people find it?
And it's just on every podcast.
Apple Podcasts,
Apple,
Spotify, all that stuff.
And then we have our immunity education group.org website. Kind of is sort
You guys
of
have a YouTube page too, right?
Yeah. Immunity Education Group has
It's
a
a
YouTube
nonprofit
page, and
that we
yeah,
started.
so that kind of helps run the podcast. And
It has a lot of good tools for new parents, people that are kind of like, where do I start? Because we're really middle of the road. As much as it might seem like, we're saying a lot of negative things, this might seem like it's dramatic.
it's because we're anti-mandate.
Yeah,
Right.
and we're
That's right.
anti-mandate, that's true.
And if you're pro-safety, you sound extreme at this point.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
a really sad indictment on this whole thing, because that's all we're asking for is safety.
Yeah, but you have your what they aren't telling you.
Yeah, I started a new
podcast
podcast
as
that kind of
well.
talks about social and political stuff, including COVID, a lot of the
Yeah.
COVID stuff, and that's also in the same Apple, Anchor, Spotify, all the podcasting
Awesome.
platforms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Well,
Cool.
thank you both for joining us
Thank
today.
you so much. We appreciate
It's
it.
been a great
Sure.
conversation. I hope y'all learned some stuff. Feel free to reach out, ask questions, post your comments, and we will extend and keep this conversation going. This very necessary conversation. So
And we'll have their podcast names put in the description of the YouTube. So if you're, I don't know if you're on Periscope, you go to YouTube and go see because you can't see it there. But if you go to YouTube, you'll see we'll put their stuff in the description.
All right.
Right.
Thank you guys
Thank
so
you
much.
guys. Bye bye.